G'day folks and welcome to an Cyclone Chasers Cyclone video update today, the 29th of January 2015. My name's Chris Nitzo. This update is brought to you by our major sponsor, Campbell Scientific Australia, when measurements matter. Obviously, the topic of conversation tonight, and we won't beat around the bush, we're going to go straight into it. We're not going to talk about rainfall, we're not going to talk about what's happening at the moment. All we're going to focus on in the next 5 to 10 minutes is this tropical low that we're all watching in the far eastern Coral Sea. If you want to know more about those sort of things, the rainfall, what's going to happen over the next week or so, become a subscriber for Oz Cyclone Chasers. Help us out, help us get into more cyclones, and we'll give you those video updates in your state subscriptions. But anyway, on to today. For the last couple of days, the Bureau of Meteorology has mentioned this week low on their tropical cyclone outlooks, and we can see here they're talking about it. A week low in the eastern Coral Sea is currently moving to the east away from the Queensland coast. The low is expected to slightly strengthen during the next few days, but poses no threat to the Queensland coast. In fact, a lot of the computer model guidance is developing that low into either a weak tropical cyclone or a moderate tropical cyclone, or at the very, very least, they're developing it into a borderline tropical cyclone. If we look at the current tropical cyclone formation potential, we can see that the southwest Pacific at the moment has a fairly high, well, not a fairly high, but high relative to the rest of the world, probability of a tropical cyclone developing. And we can see the reason for that is just a little bit of a reintroduction or a regeneration here of the MJO signature in the Western Pacific. And that MJO signature has pushed a pulse of westerly winds across the equator, and what we now have is a lot of convergence in the Western Pacific that we would normally not have had. Normally what would happen is that this MJO had already passed this region and would have died a very quiet death, but in fact it has actually regenerated itself, and that's quite unusual to see it regenerate in the Western Pacific. Anyway, what that means is that we see an increased potential for cyclogenesis, which means the birth of cyclones over the next week or two. We can see it very, very nicely here in the animated infrared imagery from the Southwest Pacific, and you can see here's Vanuatu, New Caledonia, Solomon Islands, all happening. It's really very much a very convectively active area. You can see another low pressure system right on the date line, and this is our low, the one we're watching here on the 160-degree east line. It's interesting to note that the Vanuatu Meteorological Agency is only giving this a low probability of becoming a tropical cyclone in the Vanuatu area, which basically is from that 160 line eastwards. But you can see here low is 10 to 30%. They do acknowledge its existence at 17.7, right near that 160 line, but they don't acknowledge that it has any real chance of development. Let's see what the computer models think. Well, firstly, we'll go with the one that always gets the headlines, the GFS forecast model. Now, the GFS forecast model tends to throw out some pretty wild and wacky scenarios, and sometimes, believe it or not, they do come off. And this is one of the computer models that you might see most animated over the next few days, because it's predicting a tropical cyclone to hit the southeast corner. We'll talk about that shortly. But we can see here over the next 5 days, so we're only going out to 5 days here, because after 5 days, things get very iffy and very confused when it comes to computer model guidance. But out to 5 days are usually not too bad. Now, out to 5 days, we've got an 80-knot system developing here just to the northwest or west-northwest of New Caledonia. So that's a significant Category 2 or 3, probably more likely 3 tropical cyclone there at that point in time. The UK Met model is also developing a weak tropical cyclone, a 37-knot system, which is a Category 1 tropical cyclone. And we can see the system adopts a fairly erratic motion. So we can see here on the chart, and I know it's difficult, so bear with me as I try to point this out to you. But what we can see on this chart is that the system will adopt a south to southeast motion, become very, very slow moving, and then start to move back to the west-northwest. So that's the UK Met. As I say, I do know what the UK Met shows later on, but I'm not going to share that with you right now because, as I mentioned, after the 5 or 6 day time frame, things get very confused. On the FIM model, we can see here a 57-knot system, so that's a solid Category 2 tropical cyclone, getting up to the high end of Category 2, and we can see it adopting a very slow southward motion. Now, whatever motion it adopts here is going to be reasonably, or very slow, in fact, relatively speaking to what we would expect climatologically in this region. Now, the CMC model gives us a completely alternative scenario, and is probably now the on it alone in terms of this scenario, where the system is tracking to the southeast, gets absorbed by this trough system through here, and just washes out and becomes just a broad, low-pressure system located along a trough line, and then continues to move indefinitely out here to the southeast until it washes out. Now, the CMC model is normally an outlier in most scenarios, and once again it appears to be an outlier here, but I'm not discounting it altogether, because the actual the science behind it and the fluid dynamics behind it do seem like they have some credibility, because if we do get a trough system that pushes far enough northwards, it will shear the system away, and we will be left with a broad low that's probably not even tropical. On the NavGem, it also tends to throw out some pretty wild and wacky scenarios. We can see the system here located in the South Pacific around our area of responsibility. Only 17 knots, but in the meantime, between now and 6 days' time, the model did develop it into a cyclone and had since weakened it. And I guess this is the one that everyone wants to know, the European. The European does have it tracking out towards New Caledonia, stalling just here to the northwest of the island, and then beginning a track back towards the Queensland coast towards the west. The model keeps the system at slightly below cyclone intensity at about 24 knots and peaks it at around about 31 or 32 knots, which means a very borderline Category 1 or a very strong tropical low located in this area. But you can see once again, see these yellow dots, they're so close to each other. It shows very, very slow motion of the system over the next 5 or 6 days. So it's moving about as fast as it's ever going to move right now, at least for the next 5 or 6 days. And then as of around about late tomorrow, it's expected to start to stall and then sort of just drift aimlessly in this area. One of the things that people ask us is the water out there warm enough to sustain a tropical cyclone? The answer is yes, it is. And we can see here is New Caledonia. So this is New Caledonia. Oh, let's try that again without the huge circle. There's New Caledonia right there. Here's Vanuatu, the Vanuatu group. Now, what we can see in this chart is the amount of water, the depth of water, that is 26 degrees Celsius or above. And what we're looking for is areas of green. Now, tropical cyclones not only require a water temperature of 26 degrees, they actually require it to go to a level of at least 50 meters deep. And this is something that people don't understand when they look at sea surface temperature analysis. They just look at what the actual sea surface temperature is. That's not good enough, because what happens when a cyclone actually tries to develop is it actually upwells this cooler water from underneath it. And so what happens is, if there's not enough warm water to sustain that upwelling, what we get is a situation where the cyclone can't intensify, even if the surface temperature of the water could be 30, 35 degrees. You can see here, look at the Gulf of Carpentaria. The Gulf of Carpentaria's sea surface temperature is about 33 or 34 degrees at times. But the fact is that it doesn't go that deep in terms of the depth of the water, and so therefore cyclones that tend to sit on the coast here in the Gulf tend to really struggle to get enough energy to get themselves together. But what we can see is, if the system does move to this region here and does intensify and even starts to push back towards the Queensland coast, there is absolutely nothing that says that the ocean heat content won't be there for it to do so. So if I can dispel one myth for you tonight, I hope it's that one, that it is certainly going to be warm enough, but only just for it to sustain possibly not a Category 4 or 5 system, but certainly at the lower end of the scale, the water temperatures should not be an issue. What might be an issue, though, is the fact that it stays in this area. So it stays in and around here for a prolonged period of time. So it sort of sits here for about 5 or 6 days before it makes its mind up as to whether it wants to go here or whether it wants to come back here. And, you know, when it's doing that, it's always bringing up cooler water from underneath it. So that might be a problem in 5 or 6 days' time. It's not a problem right now. Ugh, this is an ugly chart. This is what the winds are doing, about 7 kilometers up above the surface of the Earth, and we hate seeing this chart this time when it's showing this sort of stuff. And the reason we hate it is because anything that develops in the Coral Sea gets way out here, out to the east into the South Pacific. So what this is showing us is we've got an upper level low, we've got a very strong upper level trough coming through the Coral Sea at the moment. We've just really got absolutely no chance of the system moving back towards the west right now. Alright, now I'm going to fast forward you though to Sunday night, because what happens on Sunday night is we get a slight change in the steering flow. Now, the steering flow, remembering of course that our cyclone or our low, whatever it is at that stage on Sunday night, is likely to be located in this area here. Now, it's expected to be a situation where we've got very weak steering mechanisms. See these arrows? You can hardly see them in this area. That shows that we've got very weak steering. Now, what we have out further to the east is a developing upper level high. Now, that upper level high is trying to push systems in that direction. We still have this upper level trough, which sort of just sits here like an annoyance throughout southeast Queensland and back in towards northwestern New South Wales, and it just sort of sits there. But the good news from our perspective, not from the general public's perspective there, is that the system is not pushing further to the north. It's not amplifying at that point in time. Now, herein is where the model guidance differs. Some models do amplify this trough further to the north. So rather than pushing more east-west, they actually have it pushing more north-south. And if it does that, any system that is located here with an upper level high developing to its east and an upper level trough to its west will track almost certainly in that direction right there. Now, if the upper level trough does not develop in a north-south motion and rather develops in this east-west motion, then we have a situation where the system will lie in very, very weak steering. And if we fast forward even later into later next week or mid next week, what we actually see is that the computer model guidance wants to actually make this high stronger and push it further to the west. And so what we've got there is a situation where the system is tracking in a west to southwest direction. Now, the upper level trough remains, but it remains inland across Australia. And you can see here the upper level low located basically to the west of Sydney is not having that much of an effect on this system. Now, what it might do is as the system comes close to the coast, it might start to drag it more in a southerly direction rather than a continued westerly direction. But look, that's a long way ahead, folks. And look, I don't want to show you scenarios where the system starts, where some of the computer models are showing landfalls, because all that does is start panics. So if I show you the GFS model, and if I show you the UKMet model, if I show you all these computer models that are showing landfall, all it's going to do, particularly to the public that doesn't understand these things, it's just going to start panics. So I'm not going to do that in this video. I will do it in our next video if they continue to show that. And I will certainly do it for our subscribers. I'll show you where those things are expected to landfall. Okay, so let's say the worst case scenario is it starts to track west and it's a strong cyclone. What about wind shear? Now you can see here, if it starts to approach the southeast corner of Queensland, wind shear will be that strong that it'll tear it apart in about 12 hours or so. However, if it tracks a little further to the north, wind shear is more in the moderate range, and just along the coastline here of central or north Queensland, on the very, very off chance that it pushes that far to the north, we've got a situation where we've got fairly low levels of wind shear, anywhere from 20 knots and south of 20 knots, so less than 20 knots. So really, folks, wind shear is a bit of an unknown quantity this early in the piece. But if it does track to the west and that upper level low or upper level trough remains in place, then I would assume that the system will show some signs of weakening on approach to the coastline. Alrighty, that's all we got time for today in tonight's update. So if you want to know a little bit more about the landfall locations and those sort of things and what we actually think at Oz Cyclone Chasers, please think about becoming a subscriber and helping us get into more of these things in the future to document more of them. Thanks for watching, and our next update will be Sunday the 1st of February, and we will hopefully have a much better model agreement there by Sunday as to what it will do, and then we can start to talk about landfall if the models continue to show it by Sunday.